Good morning and welcome to worship this Sunday morning, August 9th. Our scripture reading, we're following in the Gospel of Matthew. A reminder that the story I'm about to read happens immediately after the feeding of the 5,000. Hear now these words. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Here ends the reading of our tradition. May we be strengthened in its hearing, and also may we find comfort and new ears for understanding. Woody Allen once infamously said, "I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens." Or as FDR said, "So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Fear. Perhaps some of you grew up with the fear not Christianity. That Christianity which paints a happily ever after, leaving no room for the open acknowledgement of fear. Now, if you're not familiar with this grander religion, here are some examples. Fear not appears in the Bible more than any other imperative. It's a commandment. This means that we fear, we sin, because we're not trusting God when we fear. Perfect love casts out fear. If you're afraid, then you're not rooted in God's love. You can't be fearful and faithful at the same time. Well, fear is a clear sign that you lack faith. Too many people have heard these lines, and instead of inspiring courage or trust, they reinforce feelings of guilt and shame and hopelessness. In our gospel story this week, the disciples contend with deep fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of suffering, fear of death, fear of oblivion. On the face of it, the story might appear to reinforce a fear not version of Christianity. See, when Peter exercises bold, fearless faith in Jesus, well, Peter's able to do the impossible. His faith empowers him to walk on water, just like Jesus. But as soon as Peter gives in to his fear, he nearly drowns. One of my favorite authors for Christian Century is Debbie Thomas, and she writes about this passage. To put it mildly, I don't agree with this reading. To put it less mildly, I think this reading is dangerous. Nowhere in the Gospels are we called to prove our faith or test God's character by taking pointless risks that threaten our lives. Nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus teach us that bad things happen to us because we're too chicken to earn God's protective care. Whether we're talking about respecting the power of the sea during a vicious storm or heeding medical advice during a global pandemic, the same caution applies. Recklessness is not faith, and stupidity is not courage. What's at play in this story is the morality or the immorality of human fear. What's at play in this story is how we respond to God's presence when we're afraid. What's at play is what we say and think and feel and do when the divine comes to us in guises we don't recognize. Now, I want to be clear, the disciples are not wrong to be afraid. Of course they're afraid. They're afraid because they aren't keen on drowning. They're afraid because gigantic waves in the middle of the night are very scary. They're afraid because they lack the tools with which to process what they're seeing. Human beings don't have the ability to walk on water, period. We can't do it. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't help me when I'm deeply afraid, really afraid, and someone asks me, why in the world are you afraid of that? Well, let's take this a step further. If we extend the meaning of drowning, the disciples were afraid they were drowning. If we extend the meaning of drowning to include all the ways in which we human beings find ourselves in over our heads in this world, then of course we experience fear. Of course we feel afraid as we face COVID-19, regardless of what a local doctor shared with the school board. And of course we're afraid of failing economies and social isolation and racial tensions, political brokenness. Of course we feel afraid when unhealthy relationships or sick loved ones or grinding jobs, financial uncertainty threaten our very lives. Of course we feel afraid when our basic biology betrays us into anxiety or panic attacks and depression. You see, the whole premise of this story from Matthew, we find the issue is not fear. The issue is where fear leads. Notice the first place that Peter's fear leads him. He has every right to be afraid when his boat pitches in the dark sea. Feeling scared in the face of danger, that's not the problem, no matter what anybody tells you. The problem is that his fear leads him straight to suspicion and distrust. His fear leads him to question Jesus' identity instead of taking Jesus' self-disclosure at face value. Listen to what Peter says. Peter basically says, you know what? If it's really you, then enable me to do the impossible. If it's really you, then make magic happen so that I will be dazzled out of all of my doubt. If it's really you, reorder reality and prove to me that you're really God. Needless to say, Peter's actions speak to our human condition, don't they? Often, like Peter, we fail to recognize the divine when the going gets tough. When we face fearsome circumstances, our go-to position is not trust, it's often suspicion. In our fear, we forget that our relationship with God is multifaceted, it's complex, and so we reduce it to something transactional. Okay, God, prove that you care about me. I'll do A, but you better do B. Interesting, isn't it, how Peter's test fails? Despite his initial boldness, he's not able to prove who Jesus is by walking on the water. Peter fails within seconds. Why? Because Jesus doesn't calm the sea for Peter's convenience. And even though Peter steps out of the boat, his circumstances remain wild and turbulent and dangerous. Did you catch the wind still comes up? If Peter thinks he can manipulate Jesus into making faith easy, he learns otherwise very fast. To trust is to hold two pictures of God's kingdom in tension. True, yes, sometimes God demonstrates God's presence in miraculous, technicolor ways. But at other times, though, we need to trust that God is present quietly in our wild, untamed lives. In the wildness of our lives, it is no proof of God's absence. I've preached this a lot, and as I've read this now, we preached it 3 years ago, now I read it in the face of a pandemic. And I look at this story differently. The power of this story doesn't lie in Peter's faith, doesn't lie in his doubt or his courage or his fear. And Peter's experience, as fascinating as it is not the point of this story. Jesus' actions are the point of the story. Because unlike Peter's, Jesus never changes. Jesus' actions are constant, they're focused, and they're relentless. From the very beginning of the story, Jesus moves toward his disciples. He moves towards them when they're struggling at sea. He moves towards them when they decide he's a menacing ghost. He moves towards them when they're terrified by his approach. He moves toward them when they're reckless enough to set him a dare. He moves towards them when they begin to drown. He moves towards them when they ask for help. He moves towards them when they're shivering and when they're sorry. Jesus moves towards them when they realize for a beautiful, flickering instant who he is and what he is. In other words, the divine never stops moving towards us. God never stops crossing the dark water to come to where we are. Neither our fearfulness or our faithlessness ever alters the Spirit's steady approach. We are the ones God is bound for. Ours is the boat God climbs into. It is for us that the Spirit calls out across the terrifying waves again and again and again. And so in these days of uncertainty, unrest, may we take courage. And may we hear these words, "It is I am here, I am with you, now and forever. You are mine, and everything will be okay." I'd like to close with this affirmation of faith. We believe that what we see before us is never all that is possible, that beyond our present is a future which could be new, with more than enough for all, and compassion greater than our own. We believe in a God who comes to the fearful people across waters of life which threaten to swamp us, and whose company is love beyond our understanding. We believe in a greater power for good than anything within each of us and all of us, which stands between us and at the center of the universe in ways of mystery and grace. May it be so this day and for this new week. In God's love, take care.